For 50 years, Moscow built one of the biggest energy networks on Earth. Gigantic oil refineries, countless kilometers of pipelines, vast storage facilities, and a labyrinth of road and rail networks linking everything together. Different pieces of the same puzzle, all with one unifying purpose: to power the largest country on the planet. Generations of Soviet and then Russian planners constructed a system of almost unprecedented size and scale, generating enough fuel to not just keep the lights on in tens of millions of homes, but to support and strengthen the nation's entire economy, as well as its military, imbuing Russia with incredible power and influence on the global stage. For decades, that same system was, without doubt, one of the country's biggest strengths. And it retained that strength, even through times of hardship. It survived the breakdown of the Soviet Union. It withstood economic crises and international sanctions. It stood firm through periods of political upheaval, and it became even bigger and better as the years went by, an unparalleled industrial behemoth, fueling one of the largest armed forces on Earth. But that monster may have finally met its match, as a system that once seemed unshakable is quite literally crumbling, and it's all thanks to Ukraine. In the month of May alone, Kyiv's forces struck multiple major Russian oil facilities, with the likes of refineries and critical logistics sites being set ablaze. And it didn't even require high-end bombers or expensive missiles. Relatively cheap and simple long-range drones were more than enough to get the job done. The result isn't just an economic crisis for Moscow to contend with, but an existential one, as the very foundations its country has been built on begin to fall apart. For Ukraine, meanwhile, this may be how the war is won, not by destroying Russia's army, but by breaking the very system that allows it to exist. But before we look at the impacts of Ukraine's campaign, we must first look at what it's actually targeting. The headlines focus mostly on oil refineries and fuel tanks, but it's actually much, much more than that. The Soviets didn't spend decades simply constructing oil plants. They built a vast and complex industrial machine, a machine that extends across thousands of square miles of land, from the oil fields of Siberia to towns, cities, and military bases many miles away. The first pieces of this machine were put into place in the aftermath of the Second World War. As the Soviet Union was emerging as a global superpower, those in the highest positions of power realized something important, something that would define geopolitics around the world for generations to come: fuel is power. Military vehicles need it. Civilian vehicles need it. Factories need it. Entire economies need it. And the Soviet Union was lucky enough to be sitting right on top of some of the world's biggest reserves of oil and gas. They didn't need to look far to find the energy that would make them rich and powerful, but they did need to come up with ways to exploit and transport it. So began one of the grandest infrastructure projects the world has ever seen. It took years. Decades, in fact. But, one piece at a time, the Soviets brought their vision to life. They made refineries, pumping stations, oil terminals, processing centers, and so much more. New facilities sprang up across the more than 6 million square miles, 17 million square kilometers, that make up the Russian Federation today. And the Soviets didn't just want this system to power their peacetime economy. They needed it to be able to withstand a war, as well. Because they'd seen what happened during the Second World War. They saw how supply chains buckled and broke beneath the weight of invasion, and they'd seen the clear connections between countries' industrial resilience and their ability to survive periods of conflict and crisis. So, to make their system as war-proof as possible, they made it layered and interconnected, with resiliency and redundancy in the form of backup systems and fail-safes. The various nodes of the system were also linked up. Rail links connected to depots, depots to pipelines, and pipelines to refineries, and by the heyday of the Cold War, this system was rapidly becoming one of the biggest and best on Earth. And it wasn't just being used for Soviet homes, businesses, and industries, but as an increasingly important economic advantage, too. Oil exports were ramping up with every passing year, funneling vast amounts of money into Moscow's coffers. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed. But it didn't actually matter, at least not to the energy sector. Even though it was a period of enormous change and political upheaval for Russia on the whole and the other former Soviet nations, all the infrastructure that had been built up to that point, as well as all the potential for power and wealth it represented, remained. The newfound Russian Federation effectively inherited a fully functioning economy, powered by those pipelines, refineries, and other facilities. They made some changes as the years passed, of course. Names changed, so did the companies owning and operating these facilities. Many were expanded and modernized as time passed, too, But the bones of the system were there to begin with and can still be seen today. Many of the country's biggest refineries have been standing for decades, like the Omsk refinery, for example, which was commissioned way back in 1955. All Russia had to do was build on that bedrock, improve the existing infrastructure, make it more efficient, more productive, and better aligned with the changing standards of the modern era. And the man to take charge of such a mammoth task was none other than Vladimir Putin himself, who came to power at the turn of the millennium. Around that time, cracks were starting to show in the Soviet infrastructure. Pipelines were getting a little rusty, and refineries were showing their age, mostly making low-quality, heavy fuel oil, rather than the higher quality forms of diesel and gasoline that the world was transitioning towards. Putin was eager to stop the slide. So, over the 2000s and into the 2010s, the Kremlin poured literally tens of billions of dollars into the country's facilities. Energy giants like Gazprom and Lukoil even brought in some of the Western world's best engineers to carry out an extensive overhaul of the infrastructure. They worked tirelessly to integrate more advanced equipment into the aging frameworks, breathing new life into facilities that looked to be on their last legs. It was an extremely expensive and time-consuming project, but it worked. All of a sudden, Russia's refineries were churning out some of the finest fuels, and the country was no longer exporting just raw materials but actively powering large parts of Europe itself, supplying a massive percentage of the continent's diesel, while still having plenty left over to power its own industries and military machines. This veritable miracle of modern engineering had been more than 50 years in the making, but it was, at last, complete, and appeared destined to be the beating heart of Russia's economy and expansion for decades, if not centuries to come. But there was a hidden flaw in this machine. A flaw that nobody could have seen, certainly not the Soviets, who would never have anticipated the types of military technologies the 21st century would bring. They built their system around a relatively small number of massive refineries, each responsible for a large part of the country's overall fuel production, rather than a larger number of smaller facilities. That matters, because if there were dozens or even hundreds of smaller refineries dotted across the Russian map, each taking on a small percentage of the total production, it wouldn't necessarily make that much difference if a few of them were damaged or destroyed during a war. But when you have these enormous mega-complexes that are so important and influential, they become equally enormous targets for any enemies that might want to damage your economy. The Soviets thought that these facilities were safe, since many of them were built deep into Russia's regions, dozens or even hundreds of miles from any international borders. The idea of any military opponent being able to target them would have seemed absurd at the time, especially with Russia being such a huge military power. But then along came Ukraine. And along came the age of drone warfare. And everything changed. It didn't happen right away. In fact, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it was able to leverage the wealth and power of its incredible oil industry not just for the opening exchanges but for the first couple of years of the conflict. Indeed, the Kremlin's energy sector was, for a long time, its biggest advantage. It didn't just have a much bigger army than Ukraine, but it had a colossal amount of infrastructure to support that army. It walked into the war with vast fuel reserves, unparalleled oil refining capacities, and an energy industry that could sustain military operations on a massive scale for years on end. Because modern warfare is highly dependent on fuel. Conflicts consume energy. Tanks, aircraft, warships, and armored vehicles, for example, burn through large amounts of fuel in no time. Supply convoys can stretch for miles and expend incalculable quantities of diesel and gasoline as they move food, ammo, and other supplies from A to B. Then, there are all the generators, communication systems, radars, air defenses, and pieces of field infrastructure that also require a steady stream of petroleum products to remain operational. Most countries around the world wouldn't be able to produce the supply to meet such high levels of demand. But Russia could, and it was all thanks to that infrastructure it had spent so long piecing together.